All right, well, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, FAQs, Geography. This webinar is one of a series of free webinars during National Campus Safety Awareness Month. My name is Abigail Boyer, Associate Executive Director of Programs for the Clery Center for Security on campus. And joining me today is my colleague, Laura Egan. So I'm just going to give her a quick moment to introduce herself.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. As Abby said, my name is Laura. I'm the Director of Training and Technical Assistance with the Clery Center. And so excited to get into a topic that might be a stressful one for others, but one that Abby and I love to talk about, geography. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. And we also hope that this webinar will help maybe reduce some stress for those of you who may have some questions, things that you're navigating on your own campus related to geography. Oftentimes we find that there are solutions, but it's a matter of figuring out or knowing where to look or what to consider. So that's really one of our goals for today's webinar. We also have our colleague Amy here today, and she'll be the producer for today's webinar, and will work with you if you have any tech-related questions throughout the session. We noticed that a couple of you were already putting in some questions before the webinar even started, which is excellent. So you're going to be using that same questions pane if you have any issues at all throughout the webinar, and we'll run through the technology in just a moment. I'm first just going to review a couple of other housekeeping items. In addition to interacting with us by typing in your questions and comments using the questions tab, we'll also have times throughout the webinar where we're going to ask you to share your thoughts on certain topic areas. We will record today's webinar, and it will be provided to you in next week's National Campus Safety Awareness Month email. One of the things that we found out last week, we were really excited by the level of interactivity and the number of questions that were coming in. We want to make sure to be able to address as much as possible. So what we're going to do here is we're going to prioritize the content that we've put together for the webinar, the frequently asked questions that we're seeing, and those that were submitted by participants ahead of time. So that'll be what we'll primarily cover in our first hour. However, if there are additional questions that are coming in throughout that we don't have the time to cover in that hour, we will hang on the line a little bit longer if we need to, just to try to get through as many as possible here today. That's certainly our goal. Before we move into some of that additional content, we just wanted to share a little bit about our work here at the Clery Center. So our organization was founded by Connie and Howard Clery, whose daughter Jean was raped and murdered on her own college campus. And really the heart of their work is figuring out how might we prevent other parents from being hurt in the same way, and how can we create structures that regardless of where a student goes to a college or a university, that they can expect specific campus safety and security policies and procedures and structures in place. So regardless of where you go, you get the report that you need and that you deserve. So the Clery Center really keeps that spirit and that heart in mind as we're doing work with campuses. And we also really try to focus on practical solutions. We know that even though the Clery Act is the same for every institution, the way that it's applied, the unique nature of your campus is what makes it unique for you. And so our goal with all of our webinars, with all of our resources, with all of our work is to really make sure that we're addressing some of the challenges and questions that we're seeing come up in the field, and we're remaining solutions focused in creating these opportunities. For the past few years, the Clery Center has used National Campus Safety Awareness Month as an opportunity to respond to some of those key questions and requests that we're hearing in the field. And the way that we do that is by creating professional development programs and resources like this one that you can participate in throughout the month or access through our National Campus Safety Awareness Month website after the fact. So we'll talk about some of the free resources we developed this year during the webinar, and certainly please continue to connect with us. If you haven't yet had a chance to sign up to participate in this year's campaign, you can do so by clicking on the link in the control panel. It's also referenced on the slide in front of you, and doing so will make sure that you'll have access to that webinar recording when it's emailed early next week. And then quickly, we also just wanted to make sure we did a quick overview of the Jean Clery Act. We don't want to spend too much time at the intro to this because we want to make sure that we're focusing on the geography, but we also wanted to be sure that all of the participants kind of come in at least with the same base level of knowledge. So as we know, the Jean Clery Act requires a number of different policies and procedures to be in place on a college campus, and those are captured within the annual security report that we know that many of you are spending a lot of time working on right now, that must be shared with your campus community by October 1st. And that annual security report captures policy statements, cliff notes of your own campus safety and security policies and procedures, as well as campus crime statistics for specific Clery Act crimes. We also know that recent amendments to Clery in 2013 through the Violence Against Women Act amendments added domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking to the list of crimes that the institution reports, as well as specific requirements related to prevention and response of those incidents. Today, this webinar is going to be focused primarily on geography, but remember we do have other webinars. We had one last week on putting together the annual security report and additional webinars on collecting statistics and on sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking this month. So although we're going to focus today on geography, please do access that recording or join us for another webinar if you want to dive into some of those additional topics. It also, the Clery Act also has ongoing requirements, so disclosures in the form of emergency notification if there's immediate threat to the health or safety of the campus community, a timely warning if there's an ongoing or serious crime that's Clery Act crime that's impacting your campus community, as well as a daily crime log for institutions that do have campus police or security. And so we know that those ongoing efforts are really what you're doing every single day. It's not just about compiling it in an annual security report, but rather the steps that we take every day to keep our campus community safe. And then the United States Department of Education enforces the Clery Act. And so oftentimes as we're talking, we are certainly going to refer to them. There may be questions that are really specific to your campus community. Because we are not the enforcement authority, we can't always give you hard feedback on specific areas that are pertaining to your own campus. But that said, there are a lot of resources and places where you can go to get that information. And oftentimes we find that the solutions are within existing information, such as the Handbook for Campus Safety and Security Reporting. So we're really going to talk to you about what we're seeing in the field, what we're hearing in the field, what we know based on what's in the statute itself. So the underlying, the statute and regulations, so the underlying law that guides the work that we do, the Handbook for Campus Safety and Security Reporting, which is sub-regulatory guidance from the department that informs our work. And we'll also talk about, in some situations, we may reference Department of Education program review findings. As the department enforces the Clery Act, program reviews are the method in which they do so. And anytime we bring it in is not to create any fear around program reviews, but rather to use them as a source of information for our work. We may also reference WestStat, who is a federal contractor for the Department of Education. They are the body that collects the statistics from the institutions, as well as runs the help desk on behalf of the department. So just to get us all on the same page in terms of some of those key players and the resources as we head into the content. And then lastly, just a quick technology review. So in your control panel, you'll notice the screen on your left looks a lot, or the image on your left looks a lot like hopefully what you're seeing on your screen. That questions pane is where you're going to be typing in answers, typing in questions, interacting with us throughout the session. And we really did intentionally design some areas to be interactive. We want to hear from you and we want to learn from you and create spaces where participants can learn from their peers as well. We also will have one poll during this session. It will be a little bit more complicated than what is your favorite color, but you'll notice in those images that'll give you an indication of what that will look like. So when we do poll you, just make sure that you use the answer, apply the answer that best fits you or your institution, and then we will be able to share the results with everyone. And then lastly, why Clery Webinar Wednesdays? Like we mentioned a little bit earlier, our goal is always to remain solutions focused. And what we find is that a lot of times when we're hearing questions, there are common challenges or things that more than one institution is navigating at the same time, where there are key resources and key information that you can look to that can help you better understand your own campus or better understand how to access and utilize those specific resources. So like we said, we will create space for additional questions in addition to those that you submitted in advance of the webinar, and there'll be times for that throughout the webinar itself. So at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Laura, who will talk a little bit more about our process for today's webinar, and we'll move forward into the content.
Thank you so much, Abby. So I just want to give a brief overview of the things that we promise that we will accomplish for you all today during the webinar, and then what this webinar is not exactly intended to do. So today we want to really be clear about reviewing the distinctions between the specific Clery geography categories. We're also going to talk about the difference between space agreements versus program agreements and how that influences whether or not you will be categorizing a building or property within your Clery geography for your institution. We'll also discuss school trip concerns and questions. There were some more delineation of expectations and criteria around classification of off-campus trips within the most recent update to the Handbook for Campus Safety and Security Reporting. So we'll go through those pieces in a little bit greater detail, give some more examples, and give you all the opportunity to ask additional questions should you have any. And then we'll also talk further about study abroad programs and the considerations that should be taken into account when determining whether or not you should include those programs within your Clery geography or not. And then lastly, we'll cover some best practices as we have come to see fit for documenting Clery geography in general, whether that's the use of a map or whether that's how you are including your locations when you are requesting local law enforcement statistics as well. So and those are just things that Abby and I and the Clery Center have picked up through not only answering technical questions, but also reviewing program reviews conducted by the Department of Education as it pertains to geography and classification of geography. So we are happy to share those best practices and tips that we have come to see come up over and over again. And then lastly, we just wanted to be clear on what this webinar is not able to do. So we are not able to provide legal advice. So if there are ever, we're actually not able to provide any sort of formal guidance in this, in technical assistance, just as we are not the enforcement authority of the Act, as Abby already mentioned earlier. And so today's webinar is intended to provide a general overview of the context for how we know the law informs questions in general. But if we do feel like there are certain questions that are coming through that are very campus specific, we might not be able to answer them over the webinar today. And we also might not be able to give a formal answer to those types of questions in general, again, just because we're not the enforcement authority. So if you find us or hear us referring to WESTAT or saying that's a question we would devote to WESTAT or refer to them, it is simply because of that reason, that they are in the best position to offer formal guidance when it comes to the classification of both crimes and pieces of geography. So we just wanted to make sure we were clear with that before we continued. So with that said, we want to go to our first chat question of the webinar today, which is, what, if any, part of Clery geography do you have trouble explaining to your campus community? So please use the chat box to submit your answers there. We just kind of want to get a better idea of what areas folks do tend to struggle with more than others. And great, I'm seeing some questions coming through, some answers coming through. Okay, great. So it seems like non-campus is a really big one. It also seems like your answers, you have questions around study abroad and those types of things, which would make a lot of sense. So that's great. And it's great to know that we will be covering a lot of the answers to these areas as we move through the webinar today. And we recognize that all of the areas in one way or another might present a challenge in understanding how they are to be defined for your particular institution. So we hope today that we provide a little bit more clarity in how to conceptualize these areas overall. And so we're going to start with an overview of the different pieces of Clery Act geography. We also wanted to be intentional about the way we are writing these words, because we understand that that might even get confusing as well. But the way we have presented these words is the way that the handbook and the Department of Education describes these specific areas. So on campus is a hyphenated word within the handbook. Non-campus is not hyphenated. It is written just like that. So it'll come up on your spell check every time. Don't worry. I always have to ignore all. And then public property is written just as that. And they do call it on-campus student housing or on-campus residential housing facilities within the handbook. So we just wanted to be clear that we are being consistent with the same terms that the handbook and the department are using to describe those pieces of geography. Your on-campus housing, or I'm sorry, your on-campus Clery geography is your core main campus. That is that contiguous part of your campus that is known to be the most core and central part of your institution. Within your on-campus property, you do have on-campus student housing, and that would be housing that is dedicated to the housing of students on your campus. As obvious as that might sound, we just want to make sure we're being clear about what that means. Your public property is any public property that is within or immediately adjacent to your on-campus property, and that would extend to the border of sidewalk, street, and sidewalk surrounding your on-campus property or your on-campus geography. Your non-campus properties are those buildings that you own or control that are not reasonably contiguous to your core campus or to your on-campus property. The recently updated handbook does provide some guidance that states that you can consider locations that you own or control that are within a mile of the border of your on-campus category or your on-campus geography to be considered reasonably contiguous. So anything beyond a mile would be considered not reasonably contiguous, but the operative word here is can, not must. So if it works for your institution to determine that buildings or property within a mile of the borders of your core campus are reasonably contiguous, you can do that and you can consider that part of your on-campus geography, but you do not have to. Certainly depending on the setup of your campus, whether or not you are in a more rural or urban setting, that mile could mean a lot of different things in terms of the amount of public property or the amount of buildings in general that you would have to account for in an on-campus capacity. So we just want to reemphasize that the department has been very clear about their specification of that 1 mile being reasonably contiguous was an effort to make sure that on-campus housing facilities were being appropriately categorized. The department was informing us that they were finding some institutions that were not counting on-campus, or they weren't counting student housing facilities as on-campus because they were off what they considered their core campus, but they were still within a mile of that core campus. So that permitted those institutions to not have to worry about fire safety regulations and missing student notification policies for those housing facilities. So the department was very intentional about wanting to make sure that you do have housing facilities that are close enough that they should be counted as on-campus student housing. But again, that is not. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Abby.
No, I just wanted to note that some of the questions coming in are, can we break down more own or control? Can we break down more what we should be thinking about in terms of those non-campus identifiers? So we will certainly be diving into some of that in just a moment. We really just wanted to introduce the concepts of these 3 separate categories, one with a subset, before we're able to dive into more of those specifics.
Yes, thank you so much for saying that, yes. And so that is just the general overview of what those 3 categories would be, and we are going to, as Abby said, get into more specifics in each of those areas. But we do want to move on to some of the questions that we have received and that we've prepared in advance as frequently asked questions that we receive in general about campus geography for the Clery Act, and then more specifically for each of these areas. And so, excuse me, right there. Yeah, so the first question that we're going to talk about is questions that we receive around space versus program agreements. So here's a sample question that we might see, which is, we send students to a hospital not owned by our institution for clinical training. How do we classify the hospital within our geography? And so the answer to this question is an overall review of space versus program agreements. And I should have said when I first started that what we really rely on a lot for what we're sharing with you today is Chapter 2 of the Handbook for Campus Safety and Security Reporting. It is all about geography, and it does highlight many of the areas that we are going to highlight and talk to you about today. And so when we're talking about space versus program agreements, that is actually within that chapter as well. And I can actually even find a page for you if that would be helpful that I can share in the questions pane throughout the session later. But it's 221, 2-21. And so what we're talking about here is, if you have an agreement for use of the space of the building or property, that means that you are being put in control of that space. versus a program agreement, which is what it sounds this question is speaking to, which would be when you have a partnership with an institution for your students to take part in a program at another location, but you don't necessarily have actual control of that space while your students are there. So if you do not have control of the space in your agreement, then you would not be classifying that building or property within your geography at all. But if you do have control of the space, depending on whether you own or just control the space, you would have Clery reporting responsibilities or requirements. And so what it really comes down to is making sure that the written agreements that you have for use of locations other than your core campus are very specific, and that you are clear as an institution on whether or not you do own or control them. When you own a location that is not part of your core campus, so we're really talking about non-campus properties right now, but if you own a non-campus property, you are responsible for reporting crimes that are reported to occur there at all times. If you only control a non-campus space, you are only responsible for reporting crimes that occur there when you are in control of the space. But as we're also noting on this slide, if you are in control, then any areas of control that you have are reportable, as well as other areas used to access that space, such as a lobby or a stairwell or an elevator. So for example, if you control a classroom space in a random office complex building from Monday through Friday, 7 a.m. to 12 p.m., September through December, then you are responsible for reporting crimes that occur within that classroom and in the spaces used to access that classroom. That doesn't within that building. That doesn't necessarily mean a parking lot. A parking lot would have to be included additionally within that agreement in order for that to be a space that you would consider reportable. Similar considerations to take into account, or common places that we see institutions having program agreements with, would be hospitals, military bases, prisons for certain classes or certain instructional requirements. So again, it's reviewing those relationships and seeing if you have an agreement to use the space or an agreement to participate in the program. And analyzing that relationship will help determine whether or not you should be classifying that building or property within your Clery geography. Abby, would you want to add anything to that question before we move on?
Yeah, absolutely. Just to kind of echo what Laura was saying, I think the magical question when it comes to Clery geography in general is asking, what do we own or what do we control? I know a lot of the questions that were coming in was really in relation to how do we know if we have control over a specific location? So just to reinforce what Laura was saying, controlled means that you have some sort of written agreement. And that written agreement can be informal. It could be an email. It could be a napkin that someone has written down that relationship on. So that's something to consider, because sometimes, for example, attorneys on the campus might not think of written agreements in the same exact way. For Clery purposes, as long as it's written down and it's giving you control over that space, then that's going to be something that you're recording or you're reflecting. Now, which category it falls under, we'll go back to that question of whether it's our on-campus building and property, so it's that building or property that's owned or controlled by the campus with the reasonably contiguous geographic area used by the institution in direct support of or related to the institution's educational purposes, including those residence halls, or that's also the area of any building or property that's within or reasonably contiguous to the area that's owned by the institution, controlled by another person, frequently used by students, and supports institutional purposes. So we always want to go back to that question of what do we actually own or control. We're going to be talking about this even more when we're talking about non-campus buildings or property, but just remember that it just goes back to those written agreements.
Another thing I would say to add on to what Abby is saying is, I know some questions were just coming through about how this is very confusing and how we don't think, or how some folks are struggling with how that fits in with the spirit of the law. And the way Abby and I like to think about this in terms of speaking to spirit is this is asking for you to identify the buildings and spaces in which you actually have the ability to respond to a campus safety concern. So it's not in an effort to not provide clear information about, even when you do just, quote unquote, just have a programmatic agreement with a hospital, but it's really trying to be an accurate reflection of what this institution's campus safety profile looks like in terms of what crime occurs in the spaces it owns or controls and how it attempts to prevent and then also respond to those crimes. So I completely understand the concern around if students are being sent to a hospital that has a very high crime rate, but that's not going to be reflected in our annual security report because it's not a space that we own, then that could perhaps be perceived as not being transparent with the consumers at the institution. But I would flip that to say there's nothing saying you can't inform your community about what crime goes on within that hospital or to the students within that program. It's just not something you would reflect as part of your own campus crime or Clery crime statistics within your annual security report, because that is really designed to be a tool just to clearly explain what your campus looks like in terms of its campus safety profile. So just try to...
So you're not limited by the law in terms of what you're able to do. And in many situations, there might also be situations in which you are responding or providing support and information. I think for the instance of sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking is a great example of that. There could be incidents for which you're not including them within your crime statistics because it doesn't fit within these constructs, but you're certainly still providing them with written information on their rights and options and supporting them in a number of different ways within the campus community. So please don't feel as though you're constricted, certainly by what's being reported here. And like Laura said, you can certainly provide support and information outside of just those requirements. Just to reinforce, because we had some questions saying, okay, so if we don't own or control it and it's not within our Clery geography, then we don't include it within our statistics, correct? And that is correct. So what we're talking about here, this Clery geography, really is going to drive what information you're including within your own statistics. Another question that we had come in is, what if we have students that are working in internships off campus? We don't own or control the business or the agencies. So that really goes back to what Laura was just describing. The question that you're asking is, do we have a space agreement or a program agreement? If you're giving control of space, then you're going to be reflecting statistics within that geography. If you only have a program agreement, so there's an agreement to send someone to that location for the program itself, but the campus isn't given any control over physical space, then it wouldn't be reflected within your statistics.
Great. So just moving on to the next question. Sorry, I clicked too excitedly there. How far does my public property extend? So as we were talking earlier about the definition of public property, first consider what falls under that. And so when we're talking about public property, we are talking about anything that is considered public or not owned by the institution itself, but not necessarily parts of anything that your institution is related to. Those would be public property pieces that are immediately bordering and is accessible from the campus, or are within your campus borders or bounds. So when we say that sidewalk, street, sidewalk rule, what we're talking about is the public property immediately bordering your campus that you are responsible for reporting on does not extend any further than the sidewalk immediately next to your campus, the street, and then the sidewalk across the street. That is that boundary for where that stops your public property reporting requirement. The other things to take into consideration around public property are that you are ensuring that there's no barrier that would exist within that public property that would prevent it from being something that is used by students, or if there is a barrier, and this is more talking about public property within your campus, truly, I guess, or maybe not, maybe it would be on the borders as well. But if there is a barrier that would prevent students from accessing that public property, then you would not be counting that public property. But then if there is, and this is just an example from the handbook, I know it sounds maybe a little wacky, but if there was a hole in a fence that did permit students to access that public property, so the fence would therefore be the barrier except for the fact that it has this hole, then that public property is now accessible by students. So there is a standard of use that would be permitted, so that would require you to count that public property as far as you are required to within your statistics. When I say as far as you are required to, we're talking about that 1 mile in, and that is just, again, pulling directly from the handbook's definition of public property itself. When it's talking about how far into a public park or a public waterway or river you need to consider, that is that 1 mile rule. And then when you're talking about public transit, so if your campus has a regional rail stop on your campus or within your public property, requirement or reporting category rather, then you would only be responsible for accounting and reporting crimes that occur there up until the point at which a rider pays a fare to get onto that train or to pay a fare in general, at which point you would no longer be responsible for reporting crimes that happen. So the spirit of that would be, you know, again, anything that your institution would be able to control. So once a rider is on that car and they are paying a fare or about to pay a fare to access that train car or that train ride, your institution is no longer responsible for reporting crimes that occur in that space.
So just to break that down a little bit further, one of the things that I think comes up during this is that identification of what you consider to be your on-campus buildings and property is really going to drive these other areas of public property or non-campus building and property. Because remember, when we're looking at public property, we're looking at that public property within or immediately adjacent to that area that we've determined to be our on-campus building and property. You won't be making a public property evaluation when it comes to non-campus buildings and property because it doesn't apply in that scenario. So really making that determination of what do we consider to be that reasonably contiguous core campus, what are the buildings and property that meet all of the different elements of the on-campus building and property definition is going to be really critical and the first piece before you can determine what your public property is. And so that's why you'll notice that Laura brought up the reasonably contiguous definition and some of the information that we recently learned from the department, that it's reasonable to consider locations within a mile when you're figuring out your on-campus buildings and property. Because again, that's really going to influence then what your public property is in relation to those locations.
Great. And so just taking, I see there's a question that just came up about what about students with commuter passes? So that's a great question. I mean, I know, and I think that's pretty specific. So I might even say that's one where I would want to get some feedback from Westat. But I see the point, I think, if I'm reading that question correctly, is they already have a fare. So, you know, they're not buying a fare every time. So I think the point to consider with this distinction, though, within the public property requirement is you're worried about the location, not as much the action. So if you're already, if you're talking about a crime that occurs at a spot at that public transit stop prior to when somebody would be collecting a fare or paying a fare, then you would be counting that crime. If the crime is occurring at a place at the public transit stop where somebody would have paid a fare, then you would not be counting that crime. Abby, would you want to contribute anything else to that answer?
Yeah, I would just say as somebody who takes a subway and a train to get to work every day, typically the experience is that the turnstile, even if they have a commuter pass, maybe they're not paying every single day, typically there's still a process for where you're crossing over using a turnstile or crossing over into that different part of public transportation. If it's something like getting on a bus, then certainly it would be when they are getting on the bus itself, because that's where they would be paying that or presenting that particular spot. But in many scenarios, the same place where you would pay that fare is also where you would present a regular commuter pass if you do have it. But if any of that's unclear, please continue to use the chat box so that we can further clarify.
So I'm just going to move on to that, talking about non-campus. So then, as Abby was saying for the previous two categories, so the reason that this information is presented actually in this order within the handbook is because you first need to determine your on-campus property in order to determine what would your public property be and then what your non-campus would be. So in terms of a step-by-step process, there is sort of a linear progression to determining your Clery geography that is intentional and that does make sense. So as Abby has been reiterating, once you are clear on what the bounds of your core campus are, you are in a better position to identify what your public property is in terms of what is within that core campus and then immediately adjacent to it following the sidewalk street sidewalk rule. And then you are in the best position to be able to identify what would be considered non-campus. We do understand that this term gives a lot of outsiders or lay people in terms of digesting Clery information a lot of confusion, because people hear non-campus and they automatically think off-campus, and that's a little bit of a misnomer. So, you know, we spend a lot of time trying to give institutions more tools to use to better communicate to their campus community what non-campus truly means. And I know that we did a webinar last Wednesday on the annual security report, but I would just add a little plug for your geography in relation to the annual security report here. Many ASRs do choose to define what the Clery crime statistics capture in terms of geography by including the Clery Act definitions for on-campus public property and non-campus, but I have found it extremely helpful when I read an annual security report that says, this is how the Clery Act defines these three terms, and this is what that means for our particular campus. So when we say on campus at Laura Egan University, we mean these particular bounds. When we are talking about public property, we mean these particular bounds or buildings or property. When we are saying non-campus, these are the locations that we mean. And I understand there's maybe a hesitation there because the ASR is kind of static. It's not a dynamic document throughout the year, and you might acquire or lose properties, or control might change. But even to give some examples of how non-campus does not necessarily mean the off-campus private bar that is 4 blocks from your core campus is so helpful in allowing your external readers to really digest the statistics and what they mean and what Clery geography is and is not. So when we're getting into talking about non-campus, we are referring to buildings or property that have all of these criteria. So either all of the first set of criteria or just that second set. So it's either buildings or property that are owned or controlled by the institution and used in direct support of or in relation to the institution's educational purposes and are frequently used by students and are not within the same reasonably contiguous geographic area of the institution. So I don't mean to be overly repetitive by reading this slide to you, but I just think it is really helpful to ensure the emphasis on those ands for each of those criteria. And then a non-campus building or property could also be the last criterion, owned or controlled by a student organization that is officially recognized by the institution. There are a lot of pieces around non-campus, so we're going to get into some of those later on throughout the webinar as well, particularly as it applies to literally off-campus trips or study abroad programs and whether or not you should be counting those properties as non-campus or not. But before we get into those, I just want to ask or share with you the next question that we see come up a lot around non-campus. And that is, how far away from a campus does a property need to be in order for it to be considered non-campus? So for those of you that love ambiguity, this is a lovely gray answer. We recognize that, but there are some pieces to consider that should help you suss out whether or not you should consider it or not. But there isn't a specific mile marker. There is no specific amount of distance that considers this non-campus property to no longer be reasonably contiguous. And that is intentional because the Act and the department recognizes that every institution is different and every setup is different, particularly in terms of how individuals intersect and interact with those buildings or property. So the first thing you would want to take into consideration is whether or not this piece of property is one first that you own or control, and then is it one that is not reasonably contiguous to your on-campus buildings or property. And we defined reasonably contiguous here as pulling this from the handbook, as the buildings or property your institution owns or controls that's in a location that you and your students consider to be and treat as part of your campus. And then it's reasonable to consider the 1 mile piece here with your locations within 1 mile of your campus border. That was what I was alluding to earlier, and the intentions around that, again, are just to ensure that institutions are properly documenting on-campus student housing facilities at a minimum. But you can consider anything within 1 mile of the borders of your campus to be reasonably contiguous. You don't have to, you can. So then anything beyond that could be considered non-campus. So, I mean, everything else that falls outside of those things would need that non-campus analysis of those pieces that we referred to on that previous slide. But the short answer is there is no definitive distance that a campus needs to be in order for it to be considered non-campus. Abby, would you add on anything else there?
No, I think the only thing that I would say is the way that it may be helpful to break it down is to, again, go back to the fact of have we figured out what is our on-campus building and property? Because that reasonably contiguous area is what's going to define or determine what our public property is. And then beyond that, beyond what we've determined to be on-campus or non-campus, is where the question of what falls under our non-campus building and property comes in. So if we haven't determined something to be within that on-campus buildings and property, so if it's beyond what's reasonably contiguous, and we know that the department now considers those locations within a mile to be a reasonable area to consider, then we would look beyond that designation to determine then from those buildings what would fall under our non-campus buildings and property, and does it meet all of the requirements. Again, for a building to be a non-campus location, it has to be owned or controlled by the institution, used in direct support of or in relation to the educational purposes, frequently used by students, and not within that same reasonably contiguous area. So if we have one of those locations that is further removed but doesn't meet all of those four metrics, so say it's not frequently used by students, it's only used by staff, for example, at the institution, that wouldn't be captured within your statistics because it wouldn't fall if it's far enough removed, and in another scenario would be non-campus, but in this case doesn't reach the non-campus level because it's not frequently used by students. We wouldn't capture it then in our statistics. And again, we also need to consider the metric of whether or not the location is owned or controlled by a student organization that's officially recognized by the institution. One of the questions that came in is a frat house that's owned by the fraternity that's located within the core campus considered to be non-campus or on campus? That's a really great question. So when we're determining or when we're looking at those locations, your Greek housing, for example, could be in either category. If it's within that reasonably contiguous area that you determine to be your on-campus buildings and property, it would be captured within your on-campus and your on-campus student housing. If it's removed and would be one of those locations that you're evaluating for non-campus, then it would fall within non-campus. So the location of those student organizations, buildings of those student organizations' owner control is going to be really important. We're seeing a lot of great questions come in as we're going along. Again, we're really going to try to keep it focused to some of the questions that we already have integrated within the webinar so that we can cover at least this content in the first hour, and any related questions that are coming in for these topics. But then we certainly are going to spend some additional time afterwards if you'd like to stay on or access the recording after to try to address as many of those other questions as possible. So that brings us to our next chat box question, and this question is, what campus partners do you communicate with when classifying trips as non-campus locations? So a lot of the questions that we're seeing coming in, a lot of you are kind of excited for this next piece related to non-campus, and that's really what we're going to tackle now. So take some time and in your questions pane, please acknowledge how or what campus partners you communicate with when you are classifying those trips. Okay, so we see athletics, administration, student groups, staff leaders. We don't have class trips, congratulations. Study abroad, fiscal officers, foreign study unit, other institutions where I'm aware of in terms of where we're traveling, ministry trips, campus security authorities, athletics, provost, head of staff, risk management, facilities, absolutely, faculty, great. So this is one of those areas where a lot of times we might often think of Clery as falling within one specific department. We know historically a lot of times institutions have considered Clery to be something that's just specific to campus police or security. And what we know and what we see is that Clery requirements actually go a lot broader than just that one department. And even though we're talking about even here the collection of crime statistics, there are so many different people and individuals who play a role in making sure that we have that information. Because if a location is part of what's considered to be your Clery geography, if you're in the role that's making that determination, you need to know that that partnership or that trip or that location is one that the institution owns or controls in order for you to be able to do your job well. So even though we have this a little bit later on, in the slides, we want to mention that we did put together a resource for National Campus Safety Awareness Month that's focused on creating a geography map, a Clery geography map, pulling together a list. And so some of those conversations, if you're finding it difficult to maybe bring together some of these campus partners to make sure that if you are a position at the institution that's really determining this geography, that information is regularly being shared with you, that might be an initial resource that might be useful to help you maybe get some of that additional buy-in or folks on board. And we'll make sure that you have the link to that. So this slide really breaks down one of the, I would say, not only frequently asked questions that we are hearing, but also one of the questions that we're seeing the most actually even in the questions pane for this webinar currently. So the question is, how do I know if my trip falls under non-campus property? So if there is a specific trip, how do we know when it crosses that mark to fall within non-campus property? Because again, in order for it to be non-campus, it has to meet those thresholds. So one, there's a property that's owned or controlled by the institution. In this situation, we're primarily talking about controlled, used in direct support of or in relation to the institution's educational purposes, frequently used by students, and not within that same reasonably contiguous geographic area. So the first would be the question of if we have a field trip with no ownership or control over the property. So if that's the case, if there's a trip in which, regardless of what the students are doing, the institution is not afforded any control over a specific location, it wouldn't be reportable within your Clery statistics because your Clery statistics are always going to be tied to that geography. The next one is an overnight trip at a location not frequently used by students. So say the institution has a trip that is only lasting one night. It is not a place that the institution regularly goes or regularly works with, and they're only, again, staying for that individual that one night. That wouldn't be reported either because remember, one of the elements for non-campus buildings and property is that location. Not only do we have control, but is it frequently used by students? So that tends to be the question prior to the new release of the new handbook that institutions were always asking, well, how do I know? At what point does a location, or do we consider a location to be frequently used by students? And so the handbook really provided some more specific constructs around it. So for the folks that have been calling the Clery Center, some of the folks that have called us post the handbook release have said, you know what, I just wanted more of a hard line around this issue. So this guidance makes it more helpful for me because I know what those constructs or what those boundaries are. So a repeated use of a location for a school-sponsored trip. So say, for example, there's an overnight trip where the individuals of the institution are going every year, they're staying at the same hotel. What the handbook says is that if we're seeing that repeated use of the location, then that would fall under our non-campus buildings and property. And the repeated use of the location is not tied to that number of days, or even that it's the same set of students. Is it frequently used by students at our institution? And so if we have been able to establish that repeated use, even if for each trip, say they're only staying for one night, if we are frequently using that same location and we go to that same location every year, that would still be considered to be non-campus buildings and property. And then the next one is short stay away trips. And so this is the language that's used in the handbook as well. And the example of a trip like that is, say, for example, an institution is going for more than one night at a location that the institution controls. It's going to be used by students and it's used to support those educational purposes. So what the handbook has specified is that those short stay away trips are considered to be non-campus buildings and property. So that's kind of the metrics that we consider. If it is just one night, but it's not frequently used by students, we're not capturing it. If it is one night, but it's frequently used by students and that we're using that same location every year, we're going to capture it. And if it's more than one night, again, used by those students, used for educational purposes, we're given control, then it falls under non-campus buildings and property. So one of the questions that we had come into the webinar in advance in an email was really around, how do we coordinate these specific types of trips? Part of that coordination is really asking the question that we asked a little bit earlier of who are we working with and who are our partners. So when it comes to the trips that are happening on at your specific institution, who are the individuals coordinating that? Is it that faculty is coordinating trips, or that you're working with faculty? Is it going through a specific department? Are we talking about trips through student affairs? Are we talking about athletics? So the kind of core question is who would have this information, who's involved in establishing these trips at our institution, because those are the folks that you want to make sure are at the table. Because the underlying understanding needs to be that when these trips are established, that is then establishing some ownership or control on behalf of the institution. And so a lot of times what we see at institutions is that these other individuals who might play a role in establishing the trips on the campus don't recognize that this even plays into Clery reporting at all, and therefore just aren't sharing the information with the individual or the office who needs to. So consider how or who you need to work with so that they know to be sharing that information in real time, so that you have a sense of what types of trips are happening and whether or not they would fall within that metric. Consider how you might coordinate some real-time sharing of information. We know that we collect information from local law enforcement as well, but a lot of times we see that collection certainly happening in the next calendar year. There could be mechanisms that the institution establishes that when they are booking that particular trip, when they're working with students for that particular trip, consider, are there things that we could do to put that in place so that we are establishing the relationship with the local law enforcement, we're establishing the relationship with individuals involved with that trip in real time, as opposed to later on trying to identify or determine what those trips were. So really consider who your partners might be at the institution for recognizing or identifying these specific trips. Okay. The next question is this piece of property a separate campus? And so we talked about on-campus buildings and property. We talked about establishing what your reasonably contiguous geographic area is. But there could also be property that the institution owns or controls that would actually fit into the category of a separate campus. One of the questions that came in earlier is, what is the distinction between a campus where there's a shared campus versus dual degrees versus a separate campus? So we'll start with the shared campus. Say, for example, you and another institution share the same space. So you're both utilizing a specific space for your own classes. Both of those institutions exist, so to speak, within the same physical space. Both of those institutions would comply independently with Clery Act reporting. So as long as you both control the space in that shared institutions scenario, then each of the institution would be reflecting any of the Clery Act crimes that occur within their Clery geography for those specific locations. And the reasoning behind that is, if I attend your institution, I'm going to be looking at your institution for the statistics or the information that might apply to me. I wouldn't necessarily know to go to that other campus to collect the information. If there's a dual degree scenario, so more than one institution has a program agreement in which an individual could take a course at another institution. Typically, those relationships do not include a shared space agreement. A lot of times it goes back to what Laura was talking about earlier in terms of an actual program agreement. So typically, dual degrees are not going to result in the institution that establishes the dual degree reporting the statistics for things that happen at that alternate location, because again, the agreement is just for a shared program, those classes, as opposed to actually shared physical space. Now, in terms of separate campuses, this is where we really need to establish whether there are locations, and typically it might even be a non-campus location or a location that we previously determined to be non-campus, that we have to ask ourselves, does this location actually meet the following criteria? Does our institution own or control the location? Is it not reasonably contiguous with the main campus, so it's a site that is removed from that reasonably contiguous geographic area that we consider to be our on-campus buildings and property? Does it have an organized program of study? So it's a location that offers courses and educational programs leading to a degree, a certificate, or other recognized credential. And is there at least one person on site acting in an administrative capacity? So that could be a director, a building coordinator, a registrar, a secretary. It doesn't mean that that person has to be on site at all times. So there could be a rotating administrator. But in order for something to be a separate campus, if it meets all, not just one, but all of that criteria, then that would establish that location as a separate campus. So an example would be a branch campus. A branch campus is always going to be a separate campus because it's geographically apart, it's independent, it's permanent, it offers those courses that are leading to a degree or the credential, it has faculty, administration, or supervisory organization, and has its own budgetary and hiring authority. So a branch campus is a really good example of a separate campus because those locations are always going to be separate. A school, though, for example, might not always be a separate campus. So say, for example, there is a law school that happens to be located within that reasonably contiguous geographic area that you consider to be your main campus, then that school would not be considered a separate campus because it doesn't meet all of that criteria and that it is still geographically contiguous with what you consider to be your on-campus buildings and property. So when you're determining whether or not a piece of property is a separate campus, what you'll want to do is ask yourself those questions. Have they met this particular metric? And this section is in on page 27 of the Handbook for Campus Safety and Security Reporting. So if you're one of those individuals who are trying to make that determination, that's a really good place to start. And then that kind of leads to the next piece, which is how do I, if I do have a separate campus, so now I've determined that our system might have more than one campus at our institutions, how do I represent that within my annual security report? And so there's two different structures that you might choose to use. One is that you are permitted to have a single document covering all campuses if it includes all accurate policy statements and crime statistics associated with the campus. So separate campuses have to comply independently with all of the Clery Act requirements. So if that's the case, if you do have separate campuses and you're choosing to put them in the same ASR, the question that you'll need to ask yourself as you put in all of those policy statements as you're looking at the statistics is, are we thoroughly including each requirement, and are we including information specific to each one of those locations? So if your processes are different, for example, for emergency notification in one location versus another, that would need to be clearly represented in your annual security report in order for you to effectively do this. Because of that, a lot of institutions, and the Department of Education has encouraged this in some of their presentations, a lot of institutions choose to have separate ASRs because it tends to be a little bit more practical. The folks that are accessing those or attending those separate campuses can easily find what they're looking for. And then the breakdown of information can be specific to those locations in a way that might not feel as convoluted or confusing as they try to navigate and determine which information best applies to them. So it's really going to depend on what your campus really feels as though is the best fit. Okay. Another thing to consider when we're looking at separate campuses is, what about study abroad? And that was another one of the questions that was frequently coming in on the questions pane. So when we're looking at locations abroad, it can fall into one of three different categories. It could be a separate campus. So we just talked about the different qualifiers that would make something a separate campus. So we would make sure that it's meeting all of those different requirements. The institution owns or controls the location. It's not reasonably contiguous. It has that organized program of study, and it has someone functioning in an administrative capacity. It could be non-campus, in that it doesn't rise to the level of a separate campus, but we do own or control the location. It's frequently used by students. It's used for those educational purposes, but it's not a part of the core campus. Or we could have locations that are not reportable. So again, we're going back and asking the question of, what do we own or control? If we are, for example, sending institutions to students to a location abroad for which we don't have any ownership or control, there's a program agreement but not a space agreement, then that wouldn't be reflected within our Clery statistics because it does not fall or it does not meet the metrics for our Clery geography. Okay. And then before we move on to wrapping up and getting into some of the lingering questions we still have here on the screen, we wanted to do a quick poll. So the question that we're asking here is, do you currently use, either internally or externally, a Clery geography map? So we've launched the poll, and our two options are yes or no, so pretty straightforward for this one. And it looks like we have about almost 50% voting. We want to see if we can get a little bit higher than that. That's my careful way of saying we are watching. We know if you voted. It tells us if you voted. All right, so I think we can go ahead and close the poll. And if we look at the results, great. So we have 59% of those of you that voted said that you do either internally or externally use a Clery map, and 41% say no. One of the things that I think that we would encourage you to consider or look at is, are there situations at our institution in which we use the language of, well, we don't usually report here, or we may do this here? Clery geography is really something that is supposed to be set in stone, so to speak. So even though our campuses are unique and we have to evaluate what falls in each category for our institutions, those locations, once they meet a definition or once they meet one of those elements of Clery geography, it's really important that we are then being consistent with that reporting, because all of those other elements that we talk about in terms of Clery really rely on, or many of the elements I should say, really rely on this. When we're reflecting our statistics, when we're evaluating whether or not a timely warning needs to be shared with the campus community, all of that is really dependent on, did this occur within our Clery geography? And so we find maps to be incredibly useful, either a map or a list, because what it does is it makes sure that you as an institution understand what locations, street addresses, buildings really do apply for your own Clery geography. So as we mentioned, we put together a project plan. It's attached within your control panel, so you can download it from there. It's on our National Campus Safety Awareness Month website as well. That's really intended to be a basic, from scratch kind of starter's approach to building this Clery geography. Some of you might be really advanced and knowledgeable in this section. You might have constructs in place that are not even reflected in this project plan, and we really commend that, and we're excited to hear about that. But we hear a lot of institutions really kind of figuring out how do we, or asking the question of how do we start these conversations on our campus? How do we make sure we're getting information from other departments? How do we really ensure that we know and understand our Clery geography on campus? So whether it's used externally to help your campus community better understand the statistics and what you're sharing with them, or whether it's used internally so that your campus security authorities and individuals doing this work on the campus better understand the work, either way, we find it to be really practical and useful and helpful. So we hope that that resource is useful to you as you're navigating these kinds of questions. One thing we should note, though, is that the Department of Education does say if you do a Clery geography map for one location, you should have it for your other locations as well. So if you do have separate campuses, something to consider to make sure that you're consistent across the board. And again, ongoing cross-campus communication regarding acquiring, selling property, and the Clery implications are going to be really, really important. So consider, again, where are these different trips happening within our campus community? Who's responsible for arranging them? Are we working, for example, with a contractor, especially when we're looking at some of those locations for study abroad? They can be a really useful and helpful resource as we're making a determination, as we're reaching out to local law enforcement. If we're working with individuals that are already playing a critical role in facilitating these trips and in communicating with individuals within that location, then really establishing relationships with them in advance is going to be really, really critical to our success in identifying and working with our Clery geography. So with that in mind, that covers some of the core questions that we had coming in advance of the webinar, and also those frequently asked questions. As we mentioned, we plan to stay on the line to go through and be able to answer some of the other questions that were coming in that we were unable to cover in the hour. So if you are unable to stay on for that, as I know it's delineated as an hour webinar, but if you're interested to hear what some of the other questions are, please free to stay on the line or to listen to the recording after the fact. We are going to plug in the evaluation into the control panel so that for those of you who have to jump off really can hopefully just take some time and give us some feedback. We love to hear what you liked, what you'd like to see more of, what you'd like to change so that we can use that to inform our future webinars and our future program. But with that in mind, we'll start diving into some of these other questions. But Laura, I don't know if there's anything that you wanted to add on or expand on from what I just said.
No, that's okay. That's fine.
Okay, great. So one of the questions that I see here is, can 2.7 miles away be considered reasonably geographically contiguous, or is it the 1 mile rule? That's a really good question. Again, you know, as we noted, the handbook doesn't give a hard line for how we determine that, but the institution does determine what is its own reasonably contiguous geographic area. So if, for example, on your campus, you think it's reasonable, you know that you have buildings in all of those locations, that individuals are regularly walking or traversing your campus, throughout those locations, and you've determined that to be reasonable, then you want to make sure that you document that information and document your decisions as to why you're including it or choosing not to include. So there's not a definitive mile marker outside of what we know for reasonably contiguous, which is to, at a minimum, consider those locations that are a mile from the border of your campus. But again, document why you made that decision. So for example, I know Laura mentioned a little bit earlier, say you are located in a city and there's a 6-lane highway, that would be a good argument for why a certain location wouldn't be reasonably contiguous if we know that there are things that are limiting access or creating barriers for our community. So those are certainly some of the questions that we should be asking ourselves when we're making this determination. And as we mentioned a little bit earlier, we also do encourage you, reach out to the Department of Education, reach out to WestAd, especially as you acquire new locations, you're evaluating these locations. They're really an important resource for helping you determine the best way to define it for your own specific campus.
Well, a couple of questions that I wanted to make sure we addressed too were some that came a little earlier on, around like maybe the 145 mark, about what constitutes like control in terms of payment. So there was one question that said, do we request information for university-sponsored student trips or all student trips, regardless of who pays for it? For example, if a sorority goes to a national conference, but either the sorority or the students pay for the trip, would we need to count it? Thanks. So the idea of payment alone as being a link to a contractual agreement of owning or control is one that we get a lot, a question that we get a lot. And I think Abby and I would be comfortable saying in our interpretation of what speaks to control, the handbook is pretty specific around, even if you are talking about ownership, control of a hotel space, it is because the institution has made that arrangement, that's what makes them in control, not just the idea of paying for it. So whether the institution makes the arrangement directly or through a third party for a hotel reservation, that puts the institution either directly or indirectly in control of the space, not just if money is like reimbursed. However, we would always recommend that you get a formal answer from WestAt on that, as that is just strictly our interpretation of the guidance and the handbook. So for this particular type of a question where you're saying, if a sorority is paying, or a sorority is organizing the reservations, or students are organizing the reservations, or students are getting reimbursed later for the cost of a hotel stay, we would not necessarily consider that to be putting the institution in control, meaning you would not need to count that space within your non-campus, unless the institution is sponsoring that trip and is sponsoring that reservation process or the control of that space. So again, we would recommend reaching out to WestAt for formal answers with that, but that was a couple of questions were about what about trips paid by the institution but student makes arrangements. So I mean, if an institution is paying but the student is making the arrangement, I think I would want clarity on what we mean by institution is paying. So if that is in the form of reimbursement, that again, I think that would be referring to the answer I just gave, but again, confirming officially with WestAt around that. Abby, would you want
And
to
I
speak any more to that?
Well, and I'd say the other thing that it brings to mind for me is that you may also have situations, and this is actually even an example in the handbook because it is frequently common, where you could have a scenario in which you are not, even though you have students that are going to an additional location, that you might not have an agreement for the space used and you're not given control of the space. So sports tournaments is an example that they use. So say the host institution is the one that's making all of the housing arrangement for the visiting students, that host institutions would certainly, would certainly be reflecting that geography within their own statistics because they have ownership or control. But if your students are going to that location, but you aren't the one that's offered or given that control, then you wouldn't be reflecting it within your statistics. So again, it's always going to go back to what do we own or what do we control. The other question that had come up, and I think this is more when we were talking especially about non-campus buildings and property in terms of this control. When Laura had given the example earlier of, say you are given a location of where you have control Monday to Friday from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. from September to December. The question was, do we report crimes there for the entire year or only September to December when you have classes there? And that's a great question and an important distinction. You're only reporting for the times in which you have control. But what that also means is it doesn't necessarily mean, or it doesn't mean that your students have to be there at the time or that your students themselves are the victims or the perpetrators in order for you to be reflecting it. Similarly to what we see for our on-campus buildings and property. Clery reporting is not tied to whether or not the person is a member of the community. It's tied to what incidents are occurring within our own geography. And so with that example, for that non-campus property where we only have control from September to December, Monday through Friday, any of those incidents that occur in the locations that you control, so if you control the third floor, for example, of the building, you would be including any incidents on that third floor, as well as any common areas that the individual would need to use to access that location for the amount of time that you have the control. So anything that occurs there on that Monday to Friday from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., even if it happens to be a holiday and your students or class is canceled because it's for the length of time that you have the control.
Great.
We're just trying to go through and look for some other questions. Laura, I don't know if you found another one that you want to tackle.
I think you addressed this, Abby, but I just want to be clear that because it was a question, it's a good question. It came through about when you are talking about completing a degree, certificate, or other recognized credential for separate campus determinations, does it have to be that you would receive the degree or receive the certificate at that location, or I guess from that location, in order for that to be considered a separate campus? And I think my interpretation of that answer is not necessarily that that institution in and of itself gives you a separate degree, but that in attending that campus's location you would get a degree. But I don't know if that's confusing it or making it more muddied. Abby, what would you say to that one?
Well, I would say, and I want to make sure I'm understanding the question correctly, so if this doesn't answer, please let us know. But I think the question that we're asking here, or seemingly the question is this location a separate campus or is this location a non-campus location? So you might have buildings in which you have classes that are leading to a degree. So say, for example, a student could take 1 or 2 classes at that specific location, but that location isn't going to meet all of the required elements for a separate campus. So the institution not only has to own or control the site, and it's not just reasonably contiguous, but it does have its own organized program of study and at least one person acting in that administrative capacity. So we'd really need to ask ourselves the question of, for that location, is it something that we consider to be a non-campus location, or is it something that we would determine to be a separate campus? And for it to be the separate campus, it would have to meet all 4 of those metrics.
But so I guess I think the person that asked this question is no longer on, so we maybe can just talk more about it offline. But I think the point was, is that degree something that separate campus has to offer in and of itself, or can it be like institutionally you would get a degree from that place, but the separate campus not necessarily is not the one issuing the degree?
again, it would depend on whether or not that location is meeting the additional metric of the person acting in the administrative capacity. So if it were the non-campus, for example, if it were the non-campus location, they might be taking those classes that are leading to a degree, and the main campus is where they're actually getting the degree from, but it's a non-campus location because it doesn't have the administrative capacity on site. It doesn't have its own budgetary and hiring authority. Whereas for the separate campuses, we're really looking at how and if does it function independently.
Right. Okay. So then it sounds like it would be that. I think it's just that the question was on that one piece. It was like as if all the other things are there, it sounds like that separate campus does have to be the one issuing that degree itself.
Typically, but what I would also say, because we don't know the specific nature of the question,
Sure.
if there were one of those locations where it sounds like the person is really asking themselves the question of, do we have a non-campus location that might actually or should be a separate location, we'd always encourage you to reach out to WestET to make that formal determination.
Sure.
Okay. Another question that I see is, we have an off-campus building that's used for corporate administrative services, such as accounting, HR. Is this area to be reported on? So if it's something that's not within your reasonably contiguous on-campus buildings and property, then what you would want to determine is does the location meet that non-campus buildings and property definition? And one of the aspects of the non-campus buildings and property definition is it frequently used by students? So even though it's used for corporate administrative services, you would want to consider, are there any other reasons, even if it's primarily HR, are there any other reasons or specifications that are causing that location to be frequently used by students, even if it's outside of just a classroom experience? So if you regularly have students frequenting the location for educational purposes, say, there's a number of internships, for example, at that location, it could potentially be a non-campus location, but in most circumstances would not, because it's primarily or it's only used for employees. So maybe a shorter way of saying that is, if the location is what you would be considering for a non-campus location, but it's only used by employees, it wouldn't meet that frequently used by students metric, and therefore wouldn't fall within your geography for non-campus. Okay. And as we continue scrolling, just seeing if there are any other ones that we didn't get a chance to answer. One of those was, and I think we may have answered this already, but if you rent a classroom at an off-campus building, are you responsible for reporting for just that room or the entire building or location? So remember, that's just for what you own or control.
I see one right here. Go ahead, Abby.
Just going to say, another one is, if you have student housing located in what would be considered non-campus, do you count an incident twice for non-campus and for student housing? So that's an important distinction. The category for on-campus student housing is specific to your on-campus buildings and property. So even if you do have an additional location for student housing that would fall within non-campus, you would not also be counting it in on-campus student housing, because that category really is specific to those captured on campus. So when we're thinking about those categories, if there's on-campus student housing, you're going to be reflecting those statistics in both the on-campus category and in the on-campus student housing category. If there's student housing that's non-campus, you're only counting it in the non-campus category. Okay. So I think that's primarily a lot of the ones that I'm seeing. Laura, are there any more that you're seeing?
Yeah, right here at the end, this our campus is on an oceanfront property. So for our Clery map, do we have to show a 1 mile radius from the geographical center of campus or 1 mile into the ocean from the shoreline? So if you're saying oceanfront, that to me sounds like that is a border of your campus is the ocean. That 1 mile rule that we were talking about is considered 1 mile from the border of your core campus. 1 mile from that border could be considered reasonably contiguous to include those properties within your core campus if you chose to. So that's the only time you should be worried about that 1 mile. for you all, if you are bordering the ocean, which I am super jealous, that sounds like an amazing campus to be a part of, first of all, but you would only go 1 mile into the ocean for counting crimes that occur there, and that would be following the idea of public property, not necessarily part of your core campus. So you would only have to go 1 mile into the ocean for the public property part of reporting, since the ocean is considered public property.
Yeah, or a way that I might reframe that is that for other institutions, they're doing the sidewalk, street, sidewalk. For you, you have sidewalk, you have ocean, so to speak. So that's the reason why you're going to do 1 mile. So because the question is specific to your Clery map, you certainly can indicate that within your map that the public property reporting only extends to that 1 mile, yes. Another person said, can you review boundary sidewalks and how it's reported? So one of the things that we keep on going back to in terms of language, is sidewalk, street, sidewalk. Because when evaluating your public property, we know that public property is that public property within or immediately adjacent. So when we're figuring out what that means, the department uses a sidewalk, street, sidewalk rule, which means you're including anything that's in that sidewalk that's adjacent to your campus, the street, and then the alternate sidewalk beyond that. I believe that that is what that question was asking us to reiterate, but if for some reason that is not answering the specific question, please let us know, and we will be sure to elaborate further. The other question is, if there's an adjacent private property that students sometimes use for parking, even though they're not supposed to, should that private parking lot be included? I can't believe there's any scenario in which students are not doing exactly what you tell them to do. But if that is the case, private property is never going to be counted within your Clery geography. So if it's something that is private, so say, for example, somebody's deciding to park on somebody's private I'm trying to think of what that word is. Their own, I should say their own private property. You wouldn't be including that information because it's not anything that you own or control, and it's not public property, and that it's owned, for example, by a public entity, so to speak. You can tell it's towards the end of the webinar because that's when my brain decides to stop working on me. I'm trying to see if we have any other ones.
I don't see any, Abby.
Okay. All right, great. Well, if there were any questions that we were unable to get to, please do reach out to us. On the screen, you see a number of different resources that we have available. In your control panel, you'll also see a link to an evaluation for today's webinar. Again, we'd really appreciate if you take a few short minutes to share your thoughts and your feedback. We'd love to know what kind of content you'd like to see in the future. This webinar was just one of several webinars for National Campus Safety Awareness Month, and the webinar recording will be included in next week's National Campus Safety Awareness Month email blast and will be available on the Clery Center's YouTube page and NACSAM website. So you can click on the links in the control panel to register for upcoming webinars and sign up to receive weekly professional development emails during National Campus Safety Awareness Month. We also encourage you to follow us on Facebook and Twitter using the Clery Center handle for daily campus safety information. You can visit our website to learn more about other training opportunities and learning resources, such as our Clery Center Collaborative Program, which is a team-based learning membership program that really brings together colleges and universities to build sustainable approaches to campus safety and Clery Act compliance. And like we said, if you do have additional questions, we do have our contact information here. Please reach out to us. We do provide technical assistance and we'll support in any way that we can. You can use that email address, info@clerycenter.org. So thank you again so much for joining us all today. We have so many of you that stayed on the line even for this additional question and answer, which we appreciate, and we really hope you all have a great afternoon.